Good morning and welcome to our UBC Learning Circle, daylighting seven colonial knots in COVID-19 pandemic response, doing our homework with the BC Office of the Provincial Health Officer. Today's conversation is presented in partnership with the Centre for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We'd like to thank the First Nations Health Authority for generously allowing us to have these UBC Learning Circle conversations. Before we formally begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect and gratitude that I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Please feel free to introduce yourself and the nation you're calling in from in the chat box. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarain Squawkin. I am the Learning Circle Manager, and I am Seal Okanagan on my mother's side and Hickory Apache and Belgian settler on my father's side. And joining us behind the scenes is Cynthia, our production coordinator. She'll be interacting with everyone in the chat. And finally, before we get into today's discussion, I'll provide a gentle heads up that the topics covered may be sensitive or emotionally triggering, so feel free to contact or talk to a friend, elder, counselor, or family member if you need so, or if you want additional support, we'll put some prompts in the chat. Now I'll turn it over to our guests to introduce themselves.
Oh, Masicho, Marcy, Sarain, and to the whole team at the Learning Circle for inviting us to share this morning. Tanche Kiawao, bon matin, Selot Ziet Nezu Nekandeta, Danielle Bain Smith Dishnakashan, Sezitla Azezon, and Michifnia Pi Echodene at E, Fort Nelson First Nation Denende Godze at E, Pi Winnipeg Doschin, Lekwangin Tanach Niwiken. So good morning. My name is Danielle Bain Smith. I'm Echodene from Fort Nelson First Nation in the northeastern part of what we call BC. I'm also Red River Métis Michif from the Red River Valley in Manitoba. I grew up in Winnipeg. My Slavey name is Azezon, which means crying all the time. And I'm very grateful to be calling in from Lekwangin Tanach here in what we call Victoria, BC. I am cisgendered, straight, she, her, and I have the great privilege of serving as BC's Deputy Provincial Health Officer for Indigenous Health and really raising my hands to our whole team for the incredible work that they've done in doing this critical self-reflection on our office and the ways that we insidiously and sometimes very overtly upheld white supremacy and Indigenous-specific racism during COVID-19, ultimately with the goal to do better today and beyond. So I'm going to pass it on to my teammates that are presenting today, and I will speak again a little bit later. So I will pass it over to my friend and colleague, Kate.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. My name's Kate Youngblood. I'm a white lady. I'm an occupier on the territory of the Musqueam people. I am also Danielle's sidekick. We are busy with building and growing an Unlearning and Undoing White Supremacy and Indigenous-specific Racism lab for population and public health. We call ourselves the U&U Lab because that is a mouthful. I'm based mostly at the BC Centre for Disease Control, where I'm a senior scientist. And I'm really glad to be here today with other colleagues from our lab. And I'll pass it over to Kirsten. Oh, I'm a she, her kind of person. And yeah, I'll pass it over to Kirsten.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kirsten. I'm also a white lady occupying the unceded and traditional territories of the Comox First Nations. I'm queer. I use she, her pronouns. I don't like presenting. And my background is as a registered nurse. My background is in emergency departments mostly, as well as in northern remote communities. And in the last year and a bit, I've been very grateful to be working as the research coordinator of the U&U Lab. One of the research coordinators of the U&U Lab, and then specifically leading this project that we're going to be talking to you a little bit about today. And I will pass it over. One thing that I do want to say is our very esteemed colleague, Chelsea Perry, who is Niska from the village of Kingolith, is at the UN this week in New York. So they will not be joining us today, but we will all be thinking about them. Over to you, Janessa.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Janessa Prince. I'm Plains Cree from Treaty 8 territory in Alberta, and I'm calling in today from the Nanaimo area, or the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw people. I am here as an Indigenous youth intern with OPHO, so it's been great to be here in this capacity, filling in with research and other things, and one of them presenting. So I'm very happy and excited to be here and presenting. And I'm not sure if anybody else needs to be introduced. Jumping right in. All right. We always begin by acknowledging the inherent rights and title of First Nations in what's now known as British Columbia. First Nations territories stretch to every inch of this province. Inherent rights that are rooted in connection to lands and waters that have never been ceded or surrendered. These inherent rights are upheld in international, national, and provincial law. These long-standing Indigenous laws and systems are integrally tied to the lands and waters of these territories, which generations of Indigenous rights holders who are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit from elsewhere in Canada also call these lands and waters home. BC First Nations, as well as other Indigenous people from elsewhere in Canada, Métis, Inuit, and First Nations who now live in BC, have inherent rights to health and wellness. These are some examples of colonial and settler obligations under international, national, and provincial law to change how we've been doing things. Another key part of our acknowledgement is acknowledging the interconnectedness of health, and this includes speaking the truth, or the EAT, the truth that the toxic drug poisoning crisis impacts First Nations peoples in BC at a drastically higher rate than settler populations, leading to the heartbreaking decrease in life expectancy that has been reported by FNHA. Death due to toxic drug poisoning is 9.9 times higher among First Nations women in BC compared to non-Indigenous women.
Okay, so the foundational obligation is to Indigenous peoples. So the key message here, we're going to be talking about this a lot today, but the key message here is that we've been asked time and time again to do things differently. And this is not about benevolence or a moral obligation, but this is actually our legal obligation under international, national, and provincial law. And what this slide really shows is that we've received hundreds of very specific instructions on how to do this work. So many of these foundational obligations relate to the health system and come from reports like the TRC calls to action, the MMIWG, 2S LGBTQIA+ calls for justice, the in plain sight recommendations, and the BC Cultural Safety and Humility Standard. And that's just to name a few that we have here in Canada. And as we look at the what or the why, what, how columns on the slide, I'm conscious that all of the work so far has been done by First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And our work as the settler health system is in this last pink column, which is under action. So this is to do the implementation of these instructions and asking, in my own sphere of influence, how are we upholding or undermining these commitments, and how are we holding space for this work? And if not, how will we hold space moving forward? So this COVID 360 project aims to action two very specific foundational obligations that were, again, specific to the COVID-19 pandemic. The first is in plain sight recommendation 15, which calls for the development of a robust Indigenous pandemic planning structure that addresses jurisdictional issues that arose during in the context of COVID-19. And then the BC Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act Action Plan 4.14 calls for an increase in resources to Indigenous partners directly related to the COVID-19 pandemic planning and response. So as we approach this work, a way that we understood these recommendations is what do we at the OPHO need to do more of, and what do we need to do less of? In order to walk with First Nations governing bodies, MNBC and FNHA in developing this robust Indigenous pandemic planning response.
Kirsten, just before you move on, I just want to chime in because I think like these conversations continue and our team is thinking through things in a dynamic and evolving way. And so just in listening to you present this morning, and we've presented this already many times, it really resonates with me, the jurisdictional issues phrase. So I just want to flag that for people that are tuning in today, because I think we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into really that as such a pervasive underlying root cause knot. And I just heard it when you said it today. So I just wanted folks to zoom in on jurisdiction.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we haven't spoke as much about jurisdiction yet, so I'm looking forward to talking about it a little bit more today, just because that is such a key piece in both of those foundational obligations. So yeah, thank you, Danielle. And so then that brings us to this project, which is so in 2022, the U&U Lab received funding from the Pacific Public Health Foundation to undertake a review of the OPHO COVID-19 pandemic response through the lens of Indigenous rights, reconciliation, and anti-racism. And so the goals of this project were to illuminate which OPHO structures, policies, practices, norms, and values upheld systemic white supremacy and racism during the COVID-19 state of emergency. Number two, to catalog the colonial knots that arose within the OPHO sphere of influence. And Kate will explain this term in just a minute. And then lastly, number three is to share findings with public health leadership towards the development and implementation of anti-racist pandemic response strategies. And that's for current public health threats as well as future public health threats. And that's what we've been really busy with on this team in the last couple of months. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Kate, now for the metaphor.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. Many of you are probably familiar with this metaphor that we've been using a lot, but just in case we have new visitors today, I want to just go over it one more time. So this image in this photo is of a giant net art installation that was at Canada Place in 2014. It's by artist Janet Echelman, and it's a giant net with a light projection. It had 860,000 individual knots, and it weighed over 3,500 pounds. And so in this metaphor that we use, we imagine each of the main lines that are holding this net to the buildings nearby as the main structures of settler colonialism. The Indian Act being a major one, the residential school system, the reserve system. But then these hundreds of thousands of smaller knots are the policies and practices that shape settler colonialism in much finer detail. And so in this metaphor, First Nations are caught in this net of imposed legislation and imposed policies and practices, which prevent those inherent rights related to land and water that Janessa was talking about at the beginning of this visit. And so we know that settler colonial laws and policies have created a segregated or race-based system, an apartheid system, where me as a settler, I can see this net from the hotel rooms nearby, the seawall, maybe the C-suite. But I am not caught in this net. And for me as a settler, often this net is rendered nearly invisible. Maybe I can just see a tiny piece lit up. But then at moments like Orange Shirt Day, or when news breaks of VPD failure to investigate Indigenous women who've died in Vancouver, the net is lit up so brightly, and all of us in the caring professions think, what can we do? But the media can recede, and it goes out of our viewpoint. And again, we are back to doing the status quo. And so for me, what this metaphor of the net really brings up is that we have, as settlers, we have a real responsibility to have heard the instructions that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people have provided, to understand which knots exist within our sphere of influence, to keep our eyes on them, and to really be busy with untying the colonial knots within our area with guidance from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And when we look at this net, there was a photo of the installation, and the humans who were up that ladder were not the artists. They weren't Sir John A. Macdonald, Duncan Campbell Scott. It was just regular, everyday Canadians doing their job. And for me, that's a reminder that even though I might not have been responsible for putting these colonial knots in place, I absolutely have a responsibility to either untie them or keep them intact. And I choose not to keep them intact and to work to untie them. And I want to recognize too that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit resistance has been so consistent throughout every stage of creation of this net. And so there are many sort of holes in this net, um, and it's resulted in quite a precarious situation, and we see that in health disparities. And so it's really, really important that we keep our eyes on it and continue to untie these colonial knots, again, with that guidance from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And that's a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly action that we need to take. So it's also daunting. Like, how do we even do that, especially when we're trying to override the ways in which we've been programmed to actually keep the net in place? And we turn really often to these three brilliant frameworks that help us. So Puglas Jody Wilson-Raybould from Wewakai Nation, in her book True Reconciliation, provides three core practices for Canadians. She asks us to learn, understand, and act. And we were really glad to hear these three tasks because we'd already been working with Dr. Camara Jones's Science and Practice of Anti-Racism framework from Public Health in America. And she was talking about how we have to name racism, ask how it's operating here, and organize and strategize to act. And so those three tasks and three core practices map beautifully together with each other. And we always put them here in this circle because we recognize it's not a linear process. We have to move iteratively over and over and over again through learn, understand, and act. And that will be our life's work. It helps us get unstuck when we get stuck. I also want to recognize Chelsea and Kirsten for bringing forward this Indigenous Gender-Based Analysis Plus toolkit into our awareness. I recognize the brilliant women on the Ministers Advisory Council on Indigenous Women who helped create it. I've got it right here. They have a series of prompts that really help us consider the ways in which the intersections of Indigenous-specific racism and settler colonialism and sex and gender can be addressed as we work to untie colonial knots. So when we started the COVID-19 360 review, again, we turned to the brilliance of JWR and her three tasks. And we started by trying to learn as much as we could. We did a small pilot review of OPHO state of emergency orders. And this was really part of, I think I'll just pause here for a second and think about those foundational obligations in Plain Sight 15 and Declaration Act 4.14. We understand that that's work that has to be done on a nation-to-nation basis, and we want to be absolutely ready and prepared so that we are not an impediment to the realization of those really, really important foundational instructions. And so this review was a chance for us to do our own homework to be ready to uphold those two key instructions. So as I said, we started with a learn. We did a pilot review of several orders. We found that there was common themes throughout. We did an environmental scan of BC COVID-19 response reviews. And then we moved into the understand. And what was really important in that moment is to see what First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people had said. And we didn't want to place an extra burden, so we went to the literature, gray literature, and peer-reviewed literature to amplify those voices. Then we also checked in with OPHO staff who were present during the COVID-19 pandemic and asked them to share with us what they saw as the colonial knots during that time. Then we started to analyze that work and sort of look what patterns and themes came up, and we moved to ACT. So we started connecting again with different Indigenous organizations and share what we had learned. So I'm going to pass it over to Kirsten, who has been the engine in this work and really holds all the information within her.
So next, kind of what we're going to dive into is kind of what we found from the results. So we wanted to highlight this quote from the Chilcotin National Government COVID-19 report, which was released in 2021, and not only to uplift the work that they did to call us into action, but also because it really underpins our approach to this work, this particular quote. So the message that materializes is the emergency is not simply the pandemic. Rather, the underlying and ongoing emergency is the persistence of colonialism in Canada and its impact on daily life. And that's a beautiful picture of Chilcotin or one of the chiefs, Joe Alphonse. So here we acknowledge the truth of the intersecting public health crises that impact First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people living in BC, which is really well documented in the literature. COVID-19 did not happen in isolation for these communities, and so it's essential that we recognize and name this as we begin to look deeper into our pandemic response. Activist Corey Cardinal has noted the COVID virus is the virus of truth. And pausing here to acknowledge the truth that Corey likely lived several of these intersections depicted in this infographic here. And tragically, he died due to a drug poisoning in 2021, shortly after his release from prison. And now moving into our map here of the colonial knots mapping into truths. So in public health, we sometimes use a river analogy where often unseen upstream determinants of health cause downstream impacts that are more visible and therefore are often the focus of, I guess, are the object of most of our focus. And we also know that it's extremely difficult to effect change in downstream impacts when we can't actually see what's causing them upstream. And this leads to our often well-meaning but ultimately flawed approach in spending time, money, and other resources in addressing these downstream impacts. So as we've just spoken about, we call these downstream impacts truths here in this project because they are COVID-19 state of emergency related realities described by Indigenous leaders, scholars, and communities. And these include pandemic-related increases in experiences of racism in healthcare, mistrust of public health, intimate partner violence, food insecurity, and health impacts of climate change. And while barriers to accessing health and social services increase disproportionately for Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, Indigiqueer, and gender diverse peoples, as well as Indigenous peoples living with disabilities. In partnership with our OPHO teammates, we were able to map these colonial knots that many of them saw come up in their fields of vision during the state of emergency. And through this process and with feedback from Indigenous public health leaders in the FNHA Public Health Response and Office of the Chief Medical Officer teams, the Chi-Mamuk team, Métis Nation BC, and the Ministry of Health Office of Indigenous Health and Reconciliation, we were able to identify the following 7 overarching colonial knots. I'll just read them out for you. Number 1, whiteness in decision-making. 2, public health is not yet trustworthy. 3, settler dominance and Indigenous invisibility. 4, barriers to exercising jurisdiction and legal pluralism not upheld. Baseline under-resourcing of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis governing bodies and organizations. Data sovereignty far from realized. Accountability to Indigenous peoples not accepted by the system. So today we're going to take a deeper dive into 3 of these colonial knots. And just pausing here for 2 key concepts, whiteness and white supremacy. For some of you, this may not be new. For some of you, this may be very new. So whiteness is the practices, policies, and perspectives that create and enable dominance of white people in norms and culture, institutions, systems, and society. Naming whiteness helps make whiteness visible and challenges the way white is often framed as neutral. And that's the definition from the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health. And it's important to note that whiteness is an ideology, not necessarily being white on its own. White supremacy can be a difficult concept to discuss for a couple reasons. The first is that it often makes us white folk feel very uncomfortable. Number 2, white supremacy is often seen as something exceptional or different from the everyday ways of leading and living in Canada. And Badewell and colleagues argue that this actually limits our ability to interrogate the ways in which white supremacy and colonial thinking is actually embedded in the politics, policies, programs, and institutions of this country. And this painting here was created by Cree artist Kent Monkman, and it's called The Daddies, and it's a recreation of Robert Harris's Fathers of Confederation painting. Harris was commissioned by Ottawa to create a painting to honor the Charlottetown Conference, which was one of the 3 conferences that ultimately led to the Confederacy of Canada. When Kent Monkman saw the original painting, he was struck by the foreground, which included this empty stool that you see here, which he then subsequently occupied with his alter ego, Miss Chief Eagle Testicle. He saw an opportunity to draw attention and to illuminate the absence and deliberate exclusion of Indigenous peoples from this really key pivotal moment in Canadian history. They were excluded from this key event because of epistemological differences and the widely held belief that Western European ways of knowing and being were superior than that of Indigenous peoples. This depicts the prevailing ideology of white supremacy, and given the absence of women in this picture, also the ideology of misogyny. And Monkman's image cheekily displays the truth that white supremacy is actually the bedrock of the structures and systems that govern our day-to-day lives here in Canada. And this belief is so deeply embedded that it continues to manifest as gross disparities in every indicator that we can count, and including the indicator of our leadership, which we'll talk about now. So colonial knot number 1, whiteness in decision-making ignores and erases Indigenous rights holders. So as shown really clearly in the painting we just saw from the beginnings of settler colonial Canada, present-day health decision makers have inherited a system of settler dominance and systemic white supremacy, where whiteness operates to uphold and protect settler interests despite ongoing harms to Indigenous peoples. So this infographic here invites us to consider if this image alone is enough to tell us that white men are more often leaders than any other demographic because they are in fact more inherently suited to lead. And I think that we can all agree that no, this is not the case. And yet BC's senior health decision-making positions have been held almost exclusively by white men. And a note, actually Danielle noted it in our last presentation, is that we need to update our graphic. We have a new little white head to add to our Prime Minister's box, at least for now, until we finish the election. Physicians hold the most senior positions within settler public health systems, yet in BC, less than 0.5% of registered physicians are First Nations. So in BC, our current Provincial Health Officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry, is the first woman to hold the role. And for the first time, because of much collaboration with Indigenous leaders, there are deputy provincial health officers who are Indigenous and people of color. Um, and First Nations in BC have decision-making structures and health systems that have existed here since time immemorial. So, despite recent recognition that legal pluralism does exist here in BC, the integration of First Nations legal systems into provincial health decisions is slow. And without conscious intervention and action, our health systems founded on whiteness continue to reinforce white supremacy, settler colonial interests, and Indigenous-specific racism. So, and this is highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic, which is this colonial knot of whiteness in decision making is central to addressing all other 6 colonial knots. And this Indigenous leaders' concerns are reaffirmed when Indigenous peoples are prevented from exercising self-determination in health decisions because of colonial barriers. They are prevented from attaining their highest potential for health. So that's a little bit of a nutshell of the learn, understand background in this colonial knot. And then just going to pass it over to Danielle to talk a lot or to get a little bit more into the specifics of the COVID-19 response.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to the team for getting us to this point. So one thing I wanted to say is we tuned in for Jenny Morgan's Learning Circle last week, and we were so impressed that her team was so succinct and left so much time for Q&A. And you will learn that we're different than that. So we have a lot to say. Thank you to the team. And I'm feeling actually, honestly, a little bit emotional thinking about this because the role that I get to play in this presentation is talking about the concrete examples of how this showed up during COVID-19. And it's emotional for me because of this tension of, and I think it has to do actually with public health as its own paradigm and institution of how we hold ourselves as a community of benevolent actors, of people that are quite righteous and really focused on advancing equity. And this was a really hard project because COVID-19 for everybody was so challenging. For those of us working in public health and on the response, we had, very specific, unique challenges of trying to do the best and balancing many different consequences and ultimately trying to, steward the way to minimize those impacts. And there were no explicitly right calls. So I really, when I'm reflecting on how did this show up, I need to recognize my teammates as well and all of the blood, sweat, and tears that went into the response. And I had the privilege of sitting next to Bonnie Henry, and I just really witnessed all of the ways that she, as a human, was depleted, but kept showing up to do her best. And yet, in spite of that, in spite of all of us attempting to do our best, we still were a part of upholding whiteness in decision-making and ignoring the rights of Indigenous and specifically in BC First Nations leaders. And as Kirsten already mentioned, this language of white supremacy and whiteness is uncomfortable. And I really am so grateful to Bonnie for always being consistent about recognizing that, yes, that language is uncomfortable. And as a settler, as a white settler, she doesn't have a right to comfort in this work because the systems that are in place are actually deadly for those of us that are on the underside of that coin. I think the concrete example that really leaps to mind for me in this context of whiteness in decision making, and then it'll tie into those jurisdictional barriers that we'll talk to in a moment, was around reimbursement for checkpoints. So I don't know if people can recall back to that time, but there were many First Nations and First Nations leaders that part of their response was to enact lockdowns of their communities, so to restrict access in and out. And so they erected security checkpoints. And through the Emergency Management BC, there was a policy in place in order to identify which expenses would be eligible for reimbursement under that pool of funding. And what was so interesting about that was that one of the things that was required in order to make a security checkpoint eligible for reimbursement is that it needed to be basically condoned or directed by the provincial health officer or a delegate. And so that was an example of this sort of tension, First Nations leaders having rights, responsibilities, and jurisdiction, and yet being prevented due to this under-resourcing from exercising that. And then also having this layer of requiring approval from a white decision maker. And so we did push back, and the whole thing was quite interesting because we were told, oh, well, a way around this is to just approve all of the requests that come forward. And we really push back to say, well, no, because that allows that colonial knot to remain intact. And we weren't using the language of colonial knots at that time, but we said, no, that allows the tyranny of the majority to remain intact. And so through advocacy and sort of standing that line, we were able to have that particular element of the policy removed so that the PHO or delegate approval was not required. Still, so much work that needs to be done. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for now. This is another slide that we want to bring forward because we want to shine a light on these two important, one being a Supreme Court case, the Tsilhqot'in title case, and then also this more recent historic agreement. So the first time in the history of this nation of Canada that Aboriginal title was recognized by settler governments without having to go through decades-long and very expensive Supreme Court proceedings. So that's what makes that in particular historic. But in spite of, for one, the Tsilhqot'in title case in 2014, we have not yet arrived at a place where we can uphold legal pluralism, where we can actually see and not interfere with Dene jurisdiction, Hulk Aminum jurisdiction, Tunaha jurisdiction, Tsilhqot'in jurisdiction and authority. So really, we should be operating from a land-based place where ideally in the COVID-19 response, our public health teams and collaborators would have had pre-existing relationships with the nation leadership on the territories that we operate, that we could have activated in a relational way in those moments to understand what are the things that you need from us in order to be able to uphold your jurisdiction as Musqueam, as Dene, as Nehiyaw, and what are the things, like how can we work together? But what happened was really this status quo of, and we'll reference an article a little bit later, but this status quo of this colonial assumption of exhaustive jurisdiction and total erasure and ignoring of the laws and authority of the nations to govern ourselves on our territories. And last thing, and then I'll pass it back to Kirsten, is just to be really crystal clear about this. When I'm referencing court cases, if we're talking about UNDRIP or the Declaration Act on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it's so critical to stay grounded in the truth that our inherent rights and responsibilities are just that. They are inherent. They are not derived from, they are not bestowed upon us from these landmark court decisions or pieces of legislation. They are inherent. They are simply recognized and affirmed through these Western legal mechanisms. Okay, thanks, Kirsten. Back to you.
Yeah, of course, that's important. That's an important point. Colonial knot number 2 is public health is not yet trustworthy. And this one, and Danielle can speak a little bit too, but I think this one is a tough one for a lot of us who work in this field. So there's clear evidence that infectious disease and public health response have functioned as tools of colonialism over the past 400 years. And that's including the mismanagement of smallpox vaccines, which then led to the drastic reduction in Indigenous populations in the 1800s. And as Canadians, we are still working to come to terms with this violence perpetuated by our institutions, including the Indian residential school system, the Indian hospitals, the medical and nutritional experiments, forced and coerced sterilization, and the current day health and child welfare systems. And so there is very good reason for Indigenous people to not trust the system. And also, as we all know in our personal and day-to-day lives, trust takes a long time to earn, especially once it's been broken. So settler colonialism and ongoing Indigenous-specific racism in Canada has fostered mistrust in healthcare and governments, and that's a reality that remains largely unaddressed by these same systems. And what we heard in this work on the COVID-19 pandemic is that the acknowledgement of these truths and the roots of the fractured trust were not clearly acknowledged in communications by the settler decision-making structures during the BC COVID-19 pandemic response. A study done by Cloche Tillicum found that only 31% of Indigenous respondents trusted pandemic guidance from public health leaders compared to 66% of white respondents. And mistrust causes real health impacts. And this was not just unique to the BC response, but scholars in other Canadian jurisdictions have connected this reality with the mistrust of vaccines rather than hesitancy, and advocating for that difference in term because that more accurately captures historic and ongoing reasons for Indigenous peoples to mistrust the health systems and the government orders. And then, yeah, passing it back to you, Danielle, to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Kirsten Masicho. Yeah, this was tricky. And even when I hear the language of mistrust, and that was, we heard a lot about vaccine hesitancy, vaccine mistrust, or mistrust in public health, it really brings me back to what we should be striving for, which is to demonstrate trustworthiness, because we as a system have not been trustworthy. And so just owning that and holding that and naming that truth is so critically important. And I get to work with a colleague based in Manitoba, Marcia Anderson, and she showed me the other day an article from the Canadian Journal of Public Health back in the 1940s. And I apologize, I can't remember the author right now, but it was so interesting because it so clearly articulated, again, the bedrock of public health and that practice in this country was all about protecting settler health and settler interests from Indigenous peoples. So the whole orientation, like those are our roots. And so it was challenging to really navigate this in the moment, to navigate this baggage of paternalism and paternalistic approaches that are still quite hardwired and, in an evidence base, and then realize that that had real impacts and harms because of this erosion of the epistemic trust that was deliberate, deliberately eroded through our lack of trustworthiness for decades and centuries preceding COVID-19. Those of you who work with me know that I love a certain parenting guru named Dr. Becky Kennedy. And I find so much of her teachings actually apply to this work as well. And so thinking about the need to repair. Like ultimately, reconciliation is about this relational repair. And she names these 3 steps of pursuing connection, taking responsibility, and acknowledging impacts on others. And we just haven't really worked through that as a system of public health yet. And so it made sense that there was lack of trust in vaccines or lack of trust in public health because we have not been trustworthy. So again, I'm here to sort of name the ways that that showed up, but also to name some of the ways that we tried to mitigate that in the moment. And I'm being really cautious in the way that I'm bringing that forward because I don't want to be selective. I don't want to minimize the work that the impacts, the harms that were caused in the moment, or the work that's left to be done, but also want to shine a light on some things that worked and areas that we can invest more in now as we're in sort of this inter-pandemic phase. So one of the things that we were really lucky to have here in, in what we call BC is pre-existing relationships with First Nations Health Authority and Métis Nation BC. So we were able to quickly, we already had regular communication. We were already on meetings together all the time. So we were able to share information back and forth. We were able to bring together, Western public health knowledge and evidence and have that disseminated through the Moccasin Telegraph, through First Nations Health Authority and Métis Nation BC lenses and different avenues of reaching community and community members. We went to many different, of course, virtual gatherings and town halls to be able to bring the message, our messages to those places, but then also be able to hear about what were the most pressing concerns and how were the public health measures and responses being manifest in those different areas and help that inform and shape the next decisions that were being made. One of the hardest areas, and actually, you know what, Kirsten, I will leave this next example and I'll pass it back to you to talk about jurisdictional barriers, and then I'll talk about this last example.
Sounds good. And I think, Danielle, you were going to give us a little intro to jurisdiction at the beginning of this slide too.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for the reminder. That's perfect. Yeah. So as we were preparing, we realized that jurisdiction may not be a very common term that's used in day-to-day Canadian life. And so I think the most basic way of thinking about jurisdiction is who's in charge and who's making the decisions. And we have really looked to the Tsilhqot'in National Government, who's published 3 reports around specific crises. So one around the wildfires in 2017, one around COVID-19, and most recently in February, Negwent led about the landslide on their territory last year. And so we found the way that they frame things, the teachings they've brought forward so helpful, especially around jurisdiction and how do we uphold legal pluralism? How do we activate legal pluralism in the moment of crisis? And so there's a paper from some scholars that worked with them called Crisis, Colonialism, and Constitutional Habit. And I just want to read one quote from that because I think it's really helpful in terms of this framing. So Emma Feltis and Jocelyn Stacey and the Tsilhqot'in National Government write, Crown actors have defaulted to well-worn patterns of colonialism. Through a detailed analysis of recent Tsilhqot'in experiences of emergency, we argue that provincial and federal responses to these extreme events reveal constitutional habits, patterns of decision-making that emerge in the immediate response to an emergency so as to appear automatic. Crown emergency responses assume exhaustive Crown jurisdiction and its corollary erasure and dispossession of Tsilhqot'in jurisdiction. I'll pass it to you, Kirsten.
Thank you. So, and then for those of us who, jurisdiction is a difficult concept for my brain to get around sometimes. So we found the most basic way of thinking about this is who is in charge, who is making the decisions, and who has the authority in that situation. So yeah, so since Canada's beginnings, the settler colonial government has assumed exhaustive jurisdiction over Indigenous lands through land theft and jurisdiction over Indigenous bodies through the residential school system, the 60 Scoop, and the present-day child welfare system, where where the Indigenous children are vastly overrepresented, as well as the criminal justice system, which is the same. The COVID-19 state of emergency brought into focus the government and the public health structures that actively prevent First Nations from exercising their inherent rights to jurisdiction and health sovereignty. And many folks on this call will probably remember the community protection blockades that many nations set up to control who came and went from their communities during the state of emergency. And this is an example of one of the ways that First Nations work to exercise jurisdiction to protect their collective community and nation well-being. And Danielle will talk a little bit more about the colonial government structures that made this a very difficult thing for nations to do. And some of the more imperfect ways that the OPHO tried to mitigate this kind of in the moment. And the last thing that I wanted to kind of bring up is that this really brings to light the clashing of different worldviews. So settlers have been trained not to see First Nations worldview. And this is an example of where this was really on display during COVID-19. So where the value of collective rights around wellness is difficult to understand for settlers, because while as settlers, we were able to tolerate the state of emergency directives kind of for the greater good for a short period of time. Ultimately, individual rights and freedoms are viewed as paramount. So as settlers, including our institutions and governance structures, we're really steeped in these well-worn default patterns of interpreting this difference in worldview is not simply a difference, but actually this other worldview as being inferior, or in this case, the blockades as not being the right choice or not correct. And rather than, and kind of missing that piece that these are actually a very loving way of protecting communities, in particular elders, children, and their more medically vulnerable members, and rooted in this really deep commitment to collective well-being. So, yeah, maybe Kate, if you could drop, so I'm just thinking about the reports that Danielle mentioned, and maybe we could drop the some links, in the chat. Thanks so much. And then I'm going to pass back to Danielle to talk a little bit more about this too.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, Kirsten. And as you were just speaking, it reminded me of, again, like the real in the moment tensions that public health practitioners and colleagues I know had in witnessing lockdowns or witnessing these security checkpoints and really feeling like their own moral distress, because in a Western settler public health ethics framework, that was overreach. The risk didn't meet the bar, because that particular framework ethic really does privilege a libertarian view and individual rights, whereas for many First Nations, we do have a sense that collective rights, collective well-being supersedes that of any one individual. And so it was this direct tension and that we experienced in the moment. And one of the other areas that I want to speak to as a way that actually all three of these knots manifested was in the sharing of data. So first, I'll tell what I think is actually a step in the right direction, not perfect, it's not the solution yet, but we did have data sharing that happened during COVID-19. So very swiftly in the early days, Dr. Henry delegated authority. So this is a problem of whiteness in decision making. So it was ultimately her decision to delegate authority to Dr. Shannon McDonald, who was the Chief Medical Health Officer at First Nations Health Authority, so that they received, FNHA received all of the status First Nations COVID-19 results. We did not get that data at all. And we were actually, this is so ironic. Post-COVID, there were so many reviews that happened, audits that happened, and the Auditor General actually came to audit the office and our response. And this was one of the areas where they sort of dinged us, I guess. And they really were critical of the fact that we didn't have First Nations data. And we had to say, no, data sovereignty, like that's actually a win that we didn't have First Nations data. So FNHA would share data with us sometimes, but they were the stewards, and that's not a perfect system. There's work still happening to advance individual nation data sovereignty here in what we call BC, but that was one thing that was happening. Métis Nation BC, similarly, we had this groundwork laid where we had a First Nations client file, we had a Métis Nation cohort that we had the feasibility to be able to do those linkages and then send them on to the governing bodies. An area that we didn't have information sharing agreement was around non-First Nations COVID-19 data for any given jurisdiction to share that with First Nations leadership. So Healtsik, Silkateen, and Nuu-Chah-Nulth Tribal Council came together as a coalition and through a Western legal framework pursued getting that information. So essentially they wanted to know about COVID-19 cases proximate to their communities, so on their lands and territories. So this was so hard, you guys. It was so hard. And again, Dr. Henry and I were approaching that, and we really did want to work in a good way and pursue connection and try and figure out how can we get the data and evidence that will be useful for First Nations leaders to be able to exercise their jurisdiction and lead their community through this crisis in a good way, in a timely way. The Western legal framework, because government has lacked trustworthiness and has been so harmful over the years, we started from an extremely adversarial positioning, which was really, really difficult. And ultimately, we got to the place of a very long, exhaustive preamble that essentially said, nobody's happy with this agreement. Nobody's satisfied. This isn't good enough. But we ultimately were, in the end, able to share some data with certain nations. It was small in scope. It took months and months and months. By the time we got to the place, and even in the moment, that data probably wasn't particularly that useful given where we were at in the pandemic, the Delta wave, like just the virus and its behavior had changed. But it was just yet another example where whiteness in decision making, the fact that we have decades and centuries of lacking trustworthiness, and just these hard ingrained, assumed to be exhaustive worldviews, frameworks, ethics, settler oriented that erase and ignore nation specific worldviews, ethics, and laws, kind of culminated in this very long, drawn out, unfortunately, very adversarial through that Western legal mechanism process. And I think we're back to the place, or not back to the place, but I think we're at the place now of really wanting, well, I know, trying to pursue connection and lay the groundwork so that we can, in a moment of crisis, be ready to act together in a way that manifests and activates legal pluralisms and jurisdiction. And just to also say, so this is an example of those various different directions and instructions that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have given us, these life-saving solutions that to date, we collectively working in settler systems, organizations, governments have still chosen not to fully implement. So one of the things that we've noticed is a hyper focus on the need for engagement that actually, I think, leads to a bit of paralysis. So people have gotten the idea that things need to change, that needs to happen with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit involvement, guidance, engagement, and please don't let that stop you from going to these documents, learning and understanding what foundational obligations you hold and what life-saving solutions have already been articulated through decades of resistance, advocacy, and engagement, and start on that column, that ACT column, so that then as you pursue connection, as you show up to different conversations and budding relationships, you can show up as a trustworthy actor who knows what your foundational obligations are, who can say, these are the first sort of timid baby steps we've taken in relation to in plain sight 6, in plain sight 15, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA plus 7.1. I'll leave it there and pass it back to my teammates. Or maybe I'm supposed to speak to this.
I don't know. I think you should read it.
Okay. I'm happy to do that because I love JWR's words. So this is taken again from that True Reconciliation book. It's one of our favorite quotes from Jody Wilson-Raybould, and I will just read it out to you. So one of the things I make sure non-Indigenous people understand is we don't need you to help heal us. We need you to fix yourselves. We need you to get those people out there who are perpetrating this process of working against reconciliation under control. We need you to straighten yourselves out. We don't need you to just step forward and say, well, here's what we can do for you, because my question is always, what are you doing for yourself? What are you doing to get rid of that violent vocal force that is holding us all back, holding us all, holding this country back? Because that is what's going to stop reconciliation. So this makes me think of our election and having racist conservative candidates speak out and spew hatred. How did settlers respond? How did you as a settler respond? The professors from the UBCO who are opposing land acknowledgements, how are you responding in this moment to get those people out there under control? Because ironically, I'm just going to go on a bit of a tangent, team, sorry, but when I read that news story about the opposition to land acknowledgements, scripted land acknowledgements, I was like, here, like I'm right there with you. I think there's nothing more ineffectual and performative than just reading a scripted land acknowledgement. What it is about is exactly this, what we're talking about, barriers to jurisdiction. It's about being place-based and land-based. And as a settler occupier, understanding the jurisdiction, the laws, the teachings, the unbroken connection of the people whose territories you occupy. And I include myself in that, right? Because I mentioned I'm Dene, I'm Michif. I live on Lekwungen territories. I'm an occupier here. So in that same way, I have responsibilities and foundational obligations to the people of this place and their more than human relatives. So uh, thank you, team, for indulging me the tangent, and I will pass it back to, I think, Kate.
I'm so glad that Kristen and Danielle shared three of the knots in detail. As you know, we identified seven different knots that came up within COVID-19 related to the OPHO's work. And at the end, we don't actually have any new recommendations. The recommendation is to go to those instructions that we've already been given through the resistance and work of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and make sure we say, look for these seven knots in your own work and make sure that you're implementing the solutions that we've already been given. We have a couple of tools that we call upon often. You've heard us talk often about the issue-specific foundational obligations related to public health. Here are the ones from Tsilhqot'in, and there are others from other nations in BC. We also have a Colonial Knot Review tool if you go to our website. And one of the things, Kirsten, if you can go to the next slide, we also have a practice that when in doubt, sort of ask yourself or your team these three questions. What homework have I and my team done to learn from the original inhabitants of these lands and waters about their laws and teachings, as well as the truths of ongoing settler colonial harm? Understand what homework have I and my team done to understand what must be done in our sphere of influence to meet these foundational obligations, and act. How have I and my team begun to act in ways that challenge, elevate, and advance true reconciliation? And again, that's the inimitable Puglas Jody Wilson-Raybould, who asks us to do things that challenge, elevate, and advance.
And if I can just jump in very quickly, because uh, Jody Wilson-Raybould asks two questions in that book, which are so helpful. And I go back to on an almost daily basis is when we're reflecting on the actions that we're taking. Are they actions that require courage and do they create uncomfortable change? Because if you're not doing those two things, you're not doing reconciliation yet. You're not doing true reconciliation. You're probably more on that performative end of the spectrum as opposed to doing something that's meaningful and impactful. And so those are so helpful to me and also remind me that this work is by design and by necessity uncomfortable. And that's good. Like if you're feeling uncomfortable, if you've got discomfort, please take that as a signal that you are doing something new and unfamiliar, not that you're doing something wrong. And that really is the road that we all need to walk together is a bumpy, unfamiliar road that should be riddled with moments of discomfort that we can navigate by taking these courageous actions. And
Can you say them one more time, the two
the
questions?
two questions, does the action require courage and does it create uncomfortable change?
The end.
The end. Last words for Danielle.
Shit.
Mic
Thank you,
drop.
everybody.
That was amazing. Wow, you guys are such a powerhouse. I always learn so much when you guys come on the learning circle. And yeah, we have tons of questions here. Um, one thing that just came to mind for me was when you guys were talking about the last couple questions. I think I do some work with Indigenous cultural safety, and when we say it's uncomfortable, it's the reason why we say it's uncomfortable is because of how embedded it is with injustice towards Indigenous folks, and how we're we're trying to show that this policies and um, whatnot are against Indigenous folks are not fair, and they're not equitable, and they're not yeah. So yeah, thank you. Our first question is this person's really excited about the presentation, and they've recently heard about your guys' program, the OPHO Unlearning Club, but they couldn't find how they could sign up. Are folks outside of the OPHO able to sign up?
Ooh, yes. It's a bit of a DIY. So I will say that Kate, so this work of unlearning and undoing white supremacy kickstarted in the office in 2021 when Kate joined as a health systems impact fellow. And so she was working with us for 2 years under the fellowship. And one of the things that Kate created for us is the Unlearning Club, which is a longitudinal co-learning journey. So she created a 17-month curriculum based on Dr. Kamara Jones's section. So the first kind of 6 months are on naming racism. The next 6 months are on asking how it operates here. And then the final months focused on organizing and strategizing to act. And so she pulled together all kinds of content already created by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit knowledge keepers and scholars, and Black scholars, and other people who hold knowledge of different systems of oppression. And so it's books, it's podcasts, it's movies, documentaries, and essentially, she was very deliberate in calling it a club. So it's not a training. There aren't facilitators or trainers. It's hosts. So people will host and hold space once a month for a small group of people to come together. You've got these different prep works that you can explore in the month preceding your meeting. And then you come together for 2 hours and use a circle protocol or process to basically share what you've learned or unlearned in any given month. And so it is that curriculum is on the website. So just kind of month by month what we did. And it has propagated to different places, but it's not an offering from us. So we've just had other groups that are interested, and then they've picked it up. Kathy Dokis, we saw you in the audience today. Hi, Kathy from Sudbury Public Health, a group that's taken it up and like run with it in the most beautiful, shiny ways. They've just done like beautiful handouts and reach out. So that was a very long-winded question to say, no, there's no way to sign up to do it with us, but we are very happy to kind of have one-off conversations as needed with people to kind of talk about how you can pick it up yourselves. We also have links maybe to some pre-recorded talks where we've talked about a little bit more about the mechanics and logistics of how you can run it for yourself with your team. Kate, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I've added in the chat the schedule, and anybody can use it. One of our principles is sharing what we've learned, which is why we're here at the learning circle, sharing uncomfortable truths about our own imperfections, and the work we're doing to try and uphold foundational obligations. I'll also say Kirsten is busy. Her next phase of work is helping us put together a workshop about the Unlearning Club and how you can host it if you want. So stay tuned. Maybe the UBC Learning Circle will have us back to share that with everyone. And yeah, go ahead, do an Unlearning Club. It's just a structured club.
Thank you. And then, so the next question is for the slides that were indicating the very few women representation, I think in the painting, how can this still be disrupted and how can we incorporate more women?
I would point back, I guess I'm just leading, sorry guys, I'm just jumping in and going for it. I think pointing back to missing and murdered Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA plus calls for justice. In plain sight, also calling for the implementation of those calls for justice and the Indigenous gender-based analysis toolkit. I think all of those documents and instructions are really show a very clear path forward about how to reinstate and honor matriarchal wisdom and guidance and governance, but also shining a light on cis heteropatriarchy and how to dismantle that. I think that is the beauty of that circle and those practices is that you can apply those, and we've started doing that to multiple systems of oppression. So in the same way that we started, trying to name racism, ask how it's operating here, and organizing and strategizing to act, we've also done that and have started in smaller ways, but to name cis heteropatriarchy and ask how it's operating here and organize and strategize to act. There's a really phenomenal book that is part of our Unlearning Club 2.0, so the second round of Unlearning Club, that's called White Women, Everything You Know About Your Own Racism and How to Do Better. So I think that's probably a very important intersection, and especially when we think about what's happening in the world and south of the border, to sort of understand how race and gender are so intimately connected, and how just addressing misogyny can actually sometimes re-entrench and worsen dynamics of racism and systemic white supremacy. So we really need to have this collective liberation across these multiple intersections. Team, yes.
Dr. Kamara Jones, she asks us to notice the absence of, which I'm glad this question came in because that's like a noticing of the absence of. But I was thinking about things the other day where I was like, how can I look in my own environment and see if there's dominance by like one group. So if I show up to work every day and my whole team is white men or white men and women exclusively, there's a pattern of dominance happening, just like the whiteness and decision making we talked at the highest levels. And we have tools in BC that help us disrupt that. We are able to seek to hire people who have been subject to systems of oppression, whether that's patriarchy or settler colonialism, etc. And so I think for me, one of the like big tactics that I can use is like, is there dominance in my sphere? Is there dominance of one group in my sphere of influence? If yes, take action. And I know that's like in this moment of hiring freezes, so difficult. And one of the things that we noticed at OPHO is that um, just saying we want to hire more First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people doesn't result in hiring more First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. There are like real knots that we have to untie to do that, and be really, really deliberate. And I think that applies to sex and gender as well. Danielle, yes.
Yes, I just wanted to note, because I think it's so important, both to name the knots and like really focus in on where things are not going well, and to also notice when things are shifting in a different way. So just recently, government's in a temporary hiring pause. There's lots of shifts happening, lots of fiscal restraint, and we've had some shifts in the Ministry of Health. But what has happened, this is the first time, at least in the decade that I've been here, that we now have a female minister, Josie Osborne. We have a female deputy minister, Cynthia Johansson. The two associate deputy ministers, Diana Clark is Gixan, Tiffany Ma is a woman of color. And then in our assistant deputy ministers, we have not quite gender parity, but we have almost gender parity. This is the first time I've ever experienced that. Prior to that, going into a senior executive team meeting for BC's Ministry of Health was absolutely a white male dominated space. And now there are shifts happening. One of the knots that we didn't talk to specifically was around accountability to Indigenous peoples. Like that's not fully accepted yet. So just because we can see the changes doesn't like we can't stop there, right? We can't say like, oh, check, it's done. Like we really need to track that all the way through to the outcomes and see the shift in outcomes, which takes longer. But to me, this is a really interesting time that we've never experienced before. And will that create tangible differences? I hope so.
Thank you. The next question is, so this person's just saying that they noticed the colonial knots identified are quite broad, and they're wondering, how did you balance recognizing big systemic knots with making them concrete and specific enough for folks to see and address?
That's a great question. And I think the process really sort of, we went from the concrete and they've coalesced into those overarching knots, but really all of those knots were informed by multiple smaller colonial knots as examples. And so today we brought forward a few of them with the security checkpoints and the data sharing. But they were, we heard stories over time and again from people that worked in the office of the ways in which we were still undermining First Nations rights and self-determination, including in looking at our written orders. Like it was quite clear, none of our written orders named the authority or jurisdiction of First Nations, right? They're all just that assumed exhaustive Crown jurisdiction. So there were many like concrete examples. And I think that's partly why Kate shared the net metaphor today, because that's the metaphor that we use to kind of look in our environs to find those concrete examples. Kirsten, it looked like you had something to share too.
I think you kind of already spoke to it. I was just going to say, the colonial knot map, like number one was this like crazy map of like a million little sticky notes. So it really started kind of from this, like, as Kate kind of talked about, the process of the work was kind of going into these, like into the literature and kind of finding these really concrete truths that have been told to us by Indigenous communities, leaders, and scholars. And then kind of again doing that process with the OPHO staff where we called it Jot the Knot, and everyone kind of came up with like 3 to 5 colonial knots that they saw from their perspective. And then from there, we kind of just kept building this crazy map until it was like so huge that it was barely legible. And then really kind of grouped it and honed it in, and then went back and checked our work, made more adjustments. And so that was kind of that piece. So that it does feel very like nebulous and meta, these big knots, but they're really informed by these more specific truths. So essentially, I think I've just paraphrased what you said, Danielle, but that kind of gives you like a little, like a window into like how these 7 knots were created. Yeah, thanks for the question.
thought of oh, sorry, Kate, go ahead. And then I've got one more example.
For me, the broadness actually is quite useful because it gives me, like, we all work in such different areas. OPHO is just like one chunk of the public health system in BC. And having them broad gives us a chance to be like, okay, how does this apply in my setting? And it probably shows up in such different ways. So for me, for that reason, the broadness is actually quite gives me agency to then try to apply it to my own little sphere because I'm also not at the OPHO anymore.
And I just thought of one other example that I wanted to share, again, that ties to all of the three knots that we shared and probably the other four as well. But there was a remote coastal nation that had very limited access, so kind of a fly-in, boat-in only community. And at a certain point in the pandemic, reached out, and they had very robust public health measures in place that went, above and beyond what was happening in other areas, settler areas of the province. And they had done an assessment, and they were at a place on their pandemic journey that the restrictions on group gatherings was really creating very serious harm in their community. And they were at a point where they absolutely needed to come together and gather for their mental, emotional, spiritual, physical wellness to be able to come together in sport and gatherings. And they had very limited COVID exposures. Like I say, they had these very stringent protocols. And it was such an interesting conversation to have because, in a way, I think the orientation was sort of a request for a permission to be exempted from that particular gathering order. And I was able to say, Dr. Henry doesn't believe that her order has jurisdiction over you or your community. So please do as you need to do. But it's just that, like, so that's a concrete example, but where if you were looking at it solely from a structured lens, like that whole interaction is dependent on one human who has all of that authority in that particular moment to have done their unlearning, be at that point in their unlearning journey to like confidently stand and say, no, this doesn't, it's overridden. But the structure itself is still so problematic, but just as a concrete example of another colonial knot.
Thank you. Next question is there a public or shareable publication related to the environmental scan of the COVID-19 responses you mentioned?
Kristen has made two beautiful fact sheets. One is about the truths and one is about the knots. And Cynthia has said that she will post them on our landing page of our UBC Learning Circle at like within the next week. We can probably do that. And then Kirsten has a whopper of a bibliography if you want to email Kirsten directly. Awesome.
I can also share the slides, and a lot of like that bibliography is on those. And then just also to say that we didn't do like a specific article about the environmental scan, if that's kind of part of the question. I think one of the teachings that I know that I've learned from Danielle is to do kind of like do the exact right amount of work that is, value added for the next stage of work that you needed to do. So this environmental scan was really to kind of let us make sure that we weren't missing anything, that when we say this work hasn't been done yet, that we could say that from a place of confidence. But yeah, there's no publication if that's what the question is. We have other things coming up, but that's not part of it. Yeah.
Thank you. This one's a long question, so I'm gonna send it to you as well. So it's about jurisdiction. Um, sending it. The question is, one barrier during the COVID response was who had the jurisdictional responsibility in terms of resources between FNHA and the health authorities. Has there been more work in terms of identifying the district jurisdictions for communities? Additionally, for those communities that have jurisdiction, how can we make sure they are inadequately funded to respond to in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I can take this one. So thank you for the question, Lindsay. And I think this is a prime example of there was a lack of clarity and a lack of trickle down of, we had and have DRIPA and that names legal pluralisms. And we have these Supreme Court cases here in what we call BC. And despite that being quite clear in many ways about jurisdiction, that didn't really trickle down through the full public health and healthcare system responses and resource allocation. So there was some places where that worked well and other places where it was a bit of a struggle. And I think that at least what I'm doing and what we're doing in the office now is really going to those Tsilhqot'in national government reports because they have very clearly, I think, articulated and put a path forward about how we can try to uphold First Nations jurisdiction specifically in times of crisis and emergency, although it can happen other times as well. But they have really, really put that into the world in a very clear, succinct way, I think. And also the article that we referenced. So I would encourage you to check those out if you haven't seen them already. And what I really love about their framing is they put out very clear calls to action to Canada, to the province of BC, and then they name the actions they're going to take. So it's so relational from the outset. It really is about that pursuing connection, taking responsibility, and then trying to move forward in a coordinated way. So I think this is the time for us to be investing our time, energy, and resources to build those relationships out, to gain more jurisdictional clarity so that as we go through, whether it's the toxic drug crisis or emerging public health emergencies and threats, that groundwork is laid so that we can get ourselves, farther along that bumpy road of reconciliation.
Thank you so much. And then we have our last question here. How can we best support those Indigenous people with great potential who are currently in such emotional turmoil that they can't move forward?
Oh, that's hard. So we think of this as very hard heart work, and we didn't have our guiding principles in the deck today, but we do start all of our work with grounding ourselves in our guiding principles, including the principle of love and care. And so ultimately, we try to ground ourselves in that as we move forward and asking the Creator to help us walk in a good way through any given moment. And just naming that truth that so many of us as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people are on intergenerational healing journeys, and it's hard and it's heavy, and we live those inequitable statistics day in and day out. And so I guess that would be my quick answer, which is not quick at all, but just doing our best to wrap ourselves in love and care, wrap each other in love and care, and then wrapping those who are hurting or suffering in any way in love and care, and centering them in the work that we're doing. Oh, I like that quote, Deb. I think that might be a Joe Gallagher quote. I just saw this is everyday work that requires everyday attention. I think that actually I probably am being quoted, but it's a Joe Gallagher quote. Masicho, Marcy, thank you so much, Serene, for having us on. It's, yeah, we're so grateful to be able to share the work.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that. My computer just glitched out. I'm so happy that you guys were able to come back and share an update on everything, and we were so happy to just hear about the amazing work you guys do and just how much love and work you guys have done to put into it. And yeah, thank you. And thank you to all our guests for joining us. And it was so great to have Kate and Danielle and Kirsten and Janessa here. And without you guys doing this work, I think it would be a lot harder, but it's so amazing that you guys are doing this work and just willing to put in the hard work and whatnot. So thank you. Just before we end the webinar, we'd love to bring your attention to our upcoming webinars. There is a day in the life of summer science that's on May 21st. And then we also have our webinars, the other next coming webinars are free to sign up for on our website, our newsletter. So if you want to look for that, that's in the chat. And our webinars are free to sign up for on our website at learningcircle.ubc.ca. And yeah, did you guys have anything else you want to add towards the end here before I say the last goodbye? Nope. Okay, great. Well, Lim, thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing everyone at our next webinar. Thank you.